Captain Blake Reynolds had been stationed on the distant planet of Andoria for 6 months. The planet was a battleground between various alien species, and Blake's mission was to keep the peace. He was a soldier through and through, loyal to his mission, and focused on one thing: the safety of humanity. But today, as he walked through the cold metal corridors of the peacekeeping station, something unusual was about to happen. It all began with a sudden commotion in the hallway. Blake was heading to the conference room for a meeting with the alien leaders of the Scifi, a race known for their advanced technology and fierce warriors. But as he rounded the corner, he saw her, an alien girl standing in the middle of the hallway. She had bright green skin that glowed softly under the artificial lights, with large, expressive black eyes that seemed to hold a world of emotions within them. Her silver hair cascaded down her shoulders like liquid mercury, and her body was slender but strong. She was dressed in the traditional robes of her people, which fluttered slightly as she moved, and her presence was both graceful and striking. Blake stopped in his tracks, surprised by her sudden appearance. It was rare for anyone, let alone an alien, to wander the halls without an official escort. He raised an eyebrow, his hand instinctively moving to the sidearm at his waist. He was trained to be cautious, especially in a place as tense as this. "Can I help you?" Blake asked, his voice steady but guarded. The girl didn't immediately respond. Instead, she stared at him, her eyes filled with curiosity and something deeper, something almost familiar. Blake wasn't sure if she was a Scifi or from another species, but she certainly wasn't someone he had met before. The Scifi usually kept to themselves during these negotiations, and Blake had never seen an alien this up close. "Are you Captain Blake Reynolds?" she asked in perfect English, her voice soft but clear. Blake nodded. "Yes. Who are you, and what are you doing here?" The girl stepped forward cautiously, holding out a small, glowing artifact in her hands. The object shimmered in the light, and Blake could feel a strange energy emanating from it. It looked ancient, like something from a lost civilization. "I'm Lissa," she said, her voice almost trembling as she spoke. "I come from the Scifi. I've been sent to give you this. It's a symbol of peace between our people." Blake eyed her warily. Peace, after all the hostility and conflict between humans and the Scifi. It was hard to believe that one girl could change anything. He had seen his fair share of false promises and failed negotiations, but something about Lissa made him hesitate. There was a gentleness in her gaze, an honesty that didn't match the usual hardened demeanor of the Scifi he had dealt with before. "Why are you giving this to me?" Blake asked, his voice still cautious. "What's the catch?" Lissa lowered her head slightly, as if ashamed of something. "There's no catch. I want to help end the war. The Scifi people have been missiled by those in power. We don't want to fight anymore." Blake didn't know how to respond. It wasn't the first time an alien had claimed to want peace, but it was the first time someone from the Scifi had made such an open gesture. Most Scifi soldiers were fierce warriors, dedicated to their cause, with little regard for humanity. So why would this young girl be so different? "I don't trust easy," Blake said finally, taking a step back. "Especially not when it comes to the Scifi. You'll have to explain more than that if you want me to believe you." Lissa nodded, her eyes looking down at the artifact in her hands. "I understand. But please, take this as a sign. The war between our peoples has caused too much suffering. We've been told lies, that humanity wants to conquer us. But it's not true, is it? You're just trying to protect your people, like we are. We need to stop the fighting, Captain." Blake studied her for a long moment, trying to understand what she was saying. She seemed sincere, but was it all an act? Had she been sent to manipulate him, or was she truly different from the other Scifi he had met? As he took the artifact from her, he couldn't help but feel a strange pull toward her. There was something about Lissa that seemed genuine. Her voice, her eyes. There was no deception there. Blake had met many alien diplomats over the years, but none had made him question his assumptions like this girl had. For a moment, The walls between him and the aliens he had fought against for so long seemed to blur. But just as quickly, Blake reminded himself of the mission at hand. He was a soldier, and soldiers had a job to do. "I'll consider what you've said, but I'm not making any promises," Blake replied, turning toward the conference room. "Stay out of trouble, Lissa." As he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter would lead to something more, something that would change the course of his mission, and perhaps his life. The peacekeeping station was quiet, save for the low hum of machinery that echoed through its corridors. Captain Blake Reynolds sat in his small quarters, the artifact Lissa had given him resting on the table before him. Its faint glow bathed the room in a soft blue light, and for the 100th time that evening, Blake found himself staring at it, his thoughts spiraling. Lissa's words replayed in his mind. Her plea for peace, her claim that the Zayeth had been missiled. It was all so different from what he had been taught about her species. They were supposed to be ruthless, unyielding in their war against humanity. And yet this girl, with her gentle eyes and trembling voice, had shown none of the hostility he'd come to expect. Blake sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He didn't trust easily, and he certainly didn't trust someone who had appeared so suddenly, bearing gifts and promises. But something about Lissa had stirred a feeling in him he couldn't ignore. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Blake stood, his hand instinctively going to his sidearm. "Who is it?" he called out. "It's me, Lissa," came the soft reply. Blake hesitated, then opened the door. Lissa stood there, looking smaller than he remembered. She clutched the edges of her silver robes nervously, her large black eyes searching his face for some hint of approval or rejection. "What do you want?" Blake asked, keeping his tone neutral. "I need to speak with you," she said. "It's important." Blake gestured for her to enter, and she stepped inside cautiously. Her gaze flickered to the artifact on the table before returning to him. "You kept it," she said, a hint of relief in her voice. "For now," Blake replied. "But I still don't know why you're here, Lissa. Why come to me? What makes you think I can help you?" Lissa sat down on the edge of the chair across from him, her hands folding tightly in her lap. "Because you're not like the others," she said quietly. "I've been watching you for weeks. You're fair. You listen. And you care about more than just winning this war." Blake raised an eyebrow. "You've been spying on me." Lissa's cheeks flushed a deep shade of green. "Not spying. Observing. I had to be sure you were someone I could trust." Blake leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "And what made you so sure?" Lissa hesitated, then said, "The way you speak to your soldiers. The way you try to protect everyone, even when it's not easy. You don't just see us as enemies. That's rare among your kind." Her words caught Blake off guard. He'd always prided himself on his sense of duty, but he hadn't realized how much of it others noticed, especially someone like Lissa. "So, what is it you want from me?" Blake asked, his tone softening slightly. Lissa took a deep breath. "I want to stop the war," she said, "but I can't do it alone. My people, they won't listen to me. They think I'm weak because I don't believe in fighting. But if you and I work together, we could find a way to end this conflict, for good." Blake frowned. "Lissa, it's not that simple. Wars don't end just because a few people want them to. There's too much at stake: resources, power, survival. And even if we could convince some of your people, what makes you think humanity would agree to peace?" "I don't know," Lissa admitted, her voice trembling. "But I have to try. I've seen too much pain, too much loss. My people are suffering, Captain. Your people are suffering. And I can't stand by and do nothing." Her words hit Blake like a punch to the gut. He had seen the suffering too, on both sides. Families torn apart, entire cities reduced to rubble. And yet he'd always told himself it was necessary, that it was the only way to protect humanity. But now, looking at Lissa, he couldn't help but wonder if there was another way. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Blake asked after a long pause. "Help me," Lissa said, leaning forward. "Help me find a way to reach the leaders of my people. If we can show them that humans aren't the enemy, maybe we can convince them to stop the fighting." Blake stared at her, his mind racing. It was a dangerous idea, one that could cost him everything if it went wrong. But as he looked into Lissa's eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. "I'll think about it," Blake said finally. "But if we do this, you'll have to follow my lead. No more surprises, no more sneaking around." "Understood." Lissa nodded quickly. "Understood. Thank you, Captain." As she stood to leave, Blake couldn't help but feel that his life had just taken a turn he wasn't prepared for. Whether this alliance would lead to peace or disaster, he didn't know. But one thing was certain. Lissa had awakened something in him that he couldn't ignore. And for the first time in a long while, Blake felt like there might be a chance for something better. The peacekeeping station settled into its usual rhythm after the day's tense negotiations, but Captain Blake Reynolds couldn't find peace within himself. The artifact Lissa had given him still pulsed faintly on his desk, a reminder of her bold claims and the fragile trust she had placed in him. Blake wasn't sure why he hadn't dismissed her outright. Perhaps it was the sincerity in her voice or the desperation in her eyes that had struck a chord deep within him. That evening, as the twin moons of Andoria cast their silver light across the base, Blake decided to meet Lissa again. She had been given temporary quarters in the Zieth diplomatic wing, a small but secure area of the station. It was rare for a soldier like Blake to visit that part of the base without official orders, and he drew a few curious glances from other personnel as he made his way there. When he reached Lissa's door, he hesitated for a moment before knocking. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing Lissa sitting cross-legged on the floor, her glowing green skin illuminated by the pale light of a holographic projection. She looked up, startled but relaxed when she saw it was him. "Captain," she said softly, standing up and smoothing her silver robes. "I didn't expect to see you here." Blake stepped inside, letting the door close behind him. "I needed to ask you some questions," he said, his tone neutral. "I need to understand why you're so different from the others." Lissa tilted her head, her expression a mix of curiosity and sadness. "Different? Because I want peace." Blake nodded. "Every Zieth I've met has been cold, calculating, and completely loyal to the war. But you're not like that. Why?" Lissa gestured for him to sit, and Blake reluctantly took a seat on a small chair by the wall. She remained standing, her eyes distant, as if she were recalling a painful memory. "My people weren't always this way," she began. "Long ago, the Zieth were explorers, artists, and thinkers. We valued knowledge and connection. But everything changed when our leaders discovered humanity. They feared your kind, your strength, your unity, your potential to rival us. So they told us you were a threat, that you would destroy us if we didn't strike first." She turned to face Blake, her black eyes shimmering with emotion. "Many of us believed them, including me. I grew up hearing stories of human cruelty, stories designed to make us hate and fear you. But as I grew older, I started to question those stories. They didn't match what I saw with my own eyes." Blake leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What did you see?" Lissa's voice softened. "I saw humans risking their lives to save each other, even in the middle of battles. I saw your compassion, your creativity, your ability to adapt. And I realized that we weren't so different after all. That's when I started speaking out, trying to convince others that this war was built on lies." Blake frowned. "And how did that go?" Lissa let out a bitter laugh. "Not well. The leaders called me a traitor. They said I was weak, that I had been corrupted by human propaganda. They stripped me of my position and sent me here as a lowly observer, hoping I'd fade into the background. But I refused to give up." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of her struggle. Blake couldn't help but feel a twinge of respect for her courage. It wasn't easy to stand up against one's own people, especially in a society as rigid as the Zieth. "So, you've been watching us, hoping to prove your leaders wrong? Blake asked. Lissa nodded. And I've seen enough to know that peace is possible. But I can't do it alone. That's why I need your help, Captain. You've seen both sides of this war. You know what's at stake. Together, we can find a way to end it. Blake leaned back, his arms crossed as he studied her. He wanted to believe her, but years of fighting had taught him to be cautious. Trust was a fragile thing, especially in a war where alliances could shift like sand in the wind. What if you're wrong? He asked. What if your leaders are too set in their ways to listen? What if this is all a trap? Lissa stepped closer, her voice firm but pleading. Then I'll take that risk. Because doing nothing is worse. I believe in you, Captain. I believe in humanity's capacity for change. And I believe that if we work together, we can find a way. Blake stared at her for a long moment, his mind a whirlwind of doubt and determination. He wanted to dismiss her as naive, but the fire in her eyes told him she was anything but. She was willing to fight for a cause she believed in, even if it meant standing alone. Finally, he stood up, his expression unreadable. I'll think about it, he said, heading for the door. But if we're going to do this, you'd better be ready for the fight of your life. Lissa nodded, a small, hopeful smile on her lips. I've been ready for a long time. As Blake walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that Lissa might just be the key to something greater, a future where peace was more than just a distant dream. Captain Blake Reynolds woke early the next morning, his thoughts still clouded by his conversation with Lissa. The Zieth girl's words had struck a chord he hadn't expected, and now they lingered, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. Could peace truly be possible? Could he trust Lissa to help bridge the impossible gap between their species? He shook his head as he prepared for the day. He wasn't a diplomat. He was a soldier. His job was to enforce orders, protect humanity, and survive the chaos of war. Yet, as he strapped on his gear, he realized that the artifact Lissa had given him, still glowing faintly on his desk, felt like a silent challenge. When Blake arrived at the station's command center, the room was alive with activity. Officers and soldiers were moving quickly between monitors, relaying updates on alien activity near the planet's borders. General Pierce, the station's commanding officer, stood at the center of the chaos, his stern face illuminated by the screens around him. Reynolds. Pierce barked, motioning for him to approach. You're late. Apologies, sir, Blake replied, standing at attention. Pierce glanced at him, his sharp eyes narrowing. What's going on with the Zieth delegation? They've been unusually quiet. You've been assigned as their liaison. Are they planning something? Blake hesitated, carefully choosing his words. They haven't made any overt moves, sir, but one of their members, Lissa, has been asking questions about peace negotiations. Peace? Pierce scoffed. The Zieth don't want peace. They want dominance. You'd be a fool to believe otherwise. Blake swallowed his frustration. With respect, sir, Lissa seems different. She claims there's a faction among the Zieth that opposes the war. Pierce leaned in, his voice dropping to a low growl. Listen to me, Reynolds. We've been fighting the Zieth for over a decade. They're cunning, manipulative, and willing to do whatever it takes to win. Don't let one soft-spoken alien girl cloud your judgment. Blake nodded but said nothing. Pierce's words echoed the training that had been drilled into him, yet he couldn't ignore the doubt creeping into his mind. Later that day, Blake met Lissa in one of the station's observation rooms. It was a small, quiet space with a large window overlooking the planet below. The blue-green surface of Andoria shimmered under the light of its twin suns, a stark contrast to the tensions brewing above. Lissa was already there, gazing out the window with a thoughtful expression. She turned when she heard Blake enter, offering him a small smile. Captain, she greeted. I wasn't sure you'd come. Blake crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. I need answers, Lissa. My superiors think this is some kind of trick. I need to know if they're right. Lissa's smile faded, and she stepped closer, her voice earnest. "I understand your doubts, but this isn't a trick, Blake. My people have suffered just as much as yours. We've lost families, homes, everything that matters. I want to stop that suffering, for both our species." "Why should I believe you?" Blake asked, his tone sharp. "Why would a Scifi care about humanity's suffering?" Lissa's gaze didn't waver. "Because I've seen it with my own eyes. I've watched humans risk everything to save each other, even their enemies. It made me question everything I was taught. And when I started asking questions, I saw the cracks in our leadership's lies. They don't want peace, Captain. They want control. But they don't speak for all of us." Blake studied her, searching for any sign of deceit. But all he saw was determination and a quiet kind of bravery. "Let's say I believe you," he said finally. "How do you plan to convince the rest of your people? Or mine, for that matter? It's not like we can just walk into a room and declare the war over." Lissa nodded, her expression serious. "I know it won't be easy, but the artifact I gave you, it's more than just a symbol. It's an ancient device, created by my ancestors. It has the power to reveal hidden truths. If we can activate it, we might be able to expose the lies our leaders have been spreading." Blake frowned. "What kind of hidden truths?" "Records, transmissions, evidence of their deception," Lissa explained. "Proof that this war was built on fear and manipulation. If we can show that to both our people, we might have a chance to stop the fighting." Blake's skepticism was clear, but so was his curiosity. The idea of ending the war without more bloodshed was tempting, even if it seemed far-fetched. "And how do we activate it?" he asked. Lissa hesitated. "That's the difficult part. The device needs a specific energy source, a rare crystal found deep within Andoria's caves. We'll have to retrieve it, and it won't be easy. The caves are heavily guarded by both Scifi forces and your own." Blake let out a slow breath. "So we're supposed to sneak into hostile territory, retrieve a rare crystal, and use it to expose the lies of two warring species. That's your plan?" Lissa met his gaze, her voice steady. "It's our best chance, Captain. I know it sounds impossible, but if we don't try, the war will never end." For a long moment, Blake said nothing. Then, finally, he straightened and nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll help you. But if this goes sideways, it's on you." Lissa's smile returned, small but genuine. "Thank you, Blake. I promise we'll make this work." As they began to discuss the details of their mission, Blake couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into uncharted territory. But for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope, a fragile, uncertain hope that maybe, just maybe, peace was within reach. The planet Andoria glimmered below as Captain Blake Reynolds prepared for the most dangerous mission of his career. The plan was straightforward in theory, but fraught with peril. He and Lissa were to infiltrate the vast network of caves beneath the planet's surface to retrieve the rare crystal required to activate the artifact. The catch: both human and Scifi patrols scoured the area, ready to eliminate any intruders. Blake adjusted his gear, his face set in grim determination as he turned to Lissa. She stood nearby, her silver robes replaced with a more practical outfit, a sleek black jumpsuit provided by the station. It was strange seeing her dressed like a soldier, but the determination in her eyes reminded Blake that she was ready to fight for her cause. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, double-checking the map on his wrist communicator. Lissa nodded, her voice steady despite the weight of their task. "If we don't retrieve the crystal, the artifact is useless. We have no other choice." Blake sighed and gestured toward the ship waiting for them. It was a small, unmarked transport, chosen for its stealth capabilities. "Let's get this over with." The journey to Andoria's surface was uneventful, the silence in the cockpit broken only by the hum of the engines. Blake kept his focus on piloting, but he couldn't help glancing at Lissa every so often. She sat in the co-pilot's seat, her hands resting on her knees, her eyes fixed on the planet growing larger in the viewport. When they entered the atmosphere, Blake activated the ship's cloaking field, ensuring they wouldn't be detected by human or Zieth sensors. He landed the transport in a remote valley, far from the main patrol routes. The caves were less than a kilometer away, but the terrain was treacherous: rocky cliffs, dense vegetation, and the ever-present threat of discovery. Blake led the way, his rifle at the ready, while Lissa followed closely, her movements surprisingly quiet for someone who had likely never been in a combat zone. As they approached the cave entrance, Blake held up a hand, signaling Lissa to stop. He scanned the area with his binoculars, his heart sinking when he spotted a group of Zieth soldiers guarding the entrance. "Figures," he muttered. Lissa stepped beside him, peering through the binoculars. Her expression hardened when she saw the soldiers. "They must know about the crystal," she whispered. Blake nodded. "Looks like we're not the only ones after it. Stay close to me." They waited until the patrol moved deeper into the cave before slipping past the entrance. The air inside was damp and cold, the walls of the cavern glowing faintly with bioluminescent moss. Blake's boots crunched softly against the rocky floor as he led Lissa deeper into the labyrinth. The further they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Strange, echoing sounds filled the tunnels, and shadows danced across the walls, making it hard to distinguish between real threats and tricks of the light. Blake kept his weapon raised, his nerves on edge. "We're close," Lissa said quietly, checking her own scanner. "The crystal's energy signature is strongest up ahead." Blake nodded but didn't relax. His instincts told him trouble wasn't far behind. As they rounded a corner, the chamber opened into a massive cavern. At its center was a jagged, glowing crystal embedded in the ground. The light it emitted bathed the entire space in an eerie blue hue. "There it is," Lissa said, awe in her voice. Blake scanned the room, his eyes narrowing when he spotted movement. Several Zieth soldiers were already there, inspecting the crystal. Blake cursed under his breath. "We can't take them head-on," he whispered. "We'll need to create a distraction." Lissa hesitated, then nodded. "I can draw their attention. You get the crystal." Blake stared at her, his expression hard. "That's too risky. If they catch you." "They won't," Lissa interrupted. "Trust me, Captain. I can do this." Reluctantly, Blake agreed. Lissa moved to the far side of the cavern, keeping to the shadows. A moment later, she picked up a loose rock and hurled it toward the opposite wall. The sound echoed loudly, drawing the Zieth soldiers' attention. Blake didn't waste a second. He sprinted toward the crystal, staying low to avoid detection. He reached it just as the soldiers began moving toward the noise. Pulling out a specialized extraction tool, he began cutting the crystal free. The process was slow, every second feeling like an eternity. Sweat dripped down Blake's face as he worked, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, with a sharp crack, the crystal came loose. "Got it," he muttered, securing it in his pack. Just as he turned to leave, a shout rang out behind him. One of the Zieth soldiers had spotted him. "Run," Lissa yelled, darting toward him. Blake didn't need to be told twice. He bolted toward the nearest tunnel, Lissa close on his heels. Blaster fire lit up the cavern behind them, the sound of energy bolts sizzling through the air. The tunnels became a blur as they ran, their pursuers close behind. Blake fired over his shoulder, forcing the Zieth to take cover, but he knew they couldn't keep this up forever. Finally, they burst out of the cave and into the open air. Their transport was just ahead, its engines already warming up. Blake covered Lissa as she scrambled aboard, then dove inside himself. As the ship lifted off, the Zieth soldiers emerged from the cave, firing wildly. But it was too late. The transport shot into the sky, disappearing into the clouds. Blake slumped back in his seat, breathing heavily. He glanced at Lissa, who was clutching the crystal tightly, her eyes shining with triumph. "We did it," she said, a small smile breaking across her face. Blake nodded, his own relief tempered by the knowledge that their mission was far from over. "Yeah," he said, But this is just the beginning. The transport glided silently through the vast expanse of space, its engines humming a steady rhythm. Captain Blake Reynolds leaned against the cockpit door, his eyes fixed on the glowing crystal secured in a containment unit. The artifact was more than a symbol now. It was their only hope of exposing the lies that had fueled the war for decades. Lissa sat nearby, her gaze alternating between the crystal and Blake. Her expression was a mix of relief and determination, though the lines of exhaustion on her face were hard to miss. "We've made it this far," she said quietly, "but the hardest part is still ahead." Blake crossed his arms, his brow furrowed. "Yeah, and now we've got 2 armies after us. The Zieth know we've got the crystal, and it's only a matter of time before my people figure it out too." Lissa nodded, her voice steady. "That's why we need to act quickly. The artifact has a failsafe. It can transmit the truth across both human and Zieth communication networks simultaneously, but it has to be activated at the right place." Blake raised an eyebrow. "And where's that?" She hesitated. "The old ruins on the neutral moon of Arion. It's a sacred site, untouched by the war. The energy field there is the only thing strong enough to power the artifact's full capabilities." Blake frowned. "Arion's in contested space. We'll have to pass through some heavy patrols to get there." "I know," Lissa replied, meeting his gaze. "But it's our best chance." Blake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fine. But if we're doing this, we're doing it my way. First, we'll need to throw off anyone tracking us." Blake's plan involved a series of calculated detours, using asteroid fields and uncharted regions to mask their trail. The journey to Arion was tense, every moment spent scanning for signs of pursuit. Blake's years of experience in evasion tactics paid off, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As they approached the neutral moon, Lissa grew quiet, her focus entirely on the task ahead. Blake noticed her fingers twitching nervously and decided to break the silence. "You've been awfully quiet," he said, adjusting the ship's trajectory. "What's on your mind?" Lissa glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "I'm just thinking about what happens next. If this works, everything will change. For both our people." Blake shrugged. "Isn't that the point?" "It is," she admitted. "But change isn't always easy. Some will resist it, no matter how much truth we reveal." Blake nodded, understanding her worry. "We'll deal with that when the time comes. For now, let's focus on getting this done." The ruins of Arion were a sight to behold. Ancient structures, weathered by time, stood tall against the moon's pale surface, their surfaces etched with intricate patterns that glowed faintly in the dim light. The air buzzed with energy, a testament to the site's unique properties. Blake and Lissa moved quickly, the crystal and artifact in hand. The ruin's central chamber, an enormous circular hall with a towering obelisk at its center, was where the activation needed to take place. "This is it," Lissa said, her voice filled with awe. "The obelisk will amplify the artifact's signal." Blake set the crystal down at the base of the obelisk while Lissa placed the artifact on a raised platform. Together, they connected the two, the crystal's light growing brighter as it synchronized with the artifact's internal mechanisms. A low hum filled the chamber, growing louder as the artifact powered up. Blake couldn't help but feel a mix of anticipation and dread. "How long will this take?" he asked, his voice tense. "Not long," Lissa replied. "But once it starts transmitting, there's no turning back." Suddenly, a warning tone blared from Blake's communicator. He pulled it out, his stomach sinking at the sight of multiple signals converging on their location. "We've got company," he said grimly. Lissa's face paled. "How many?" "Too many," Blake said, readying his weapon. "Both Zieth and human ships. They must have tracked us." Lissa looked at the artifact, its hum growing into a steady pulse. "We need to hold them off long enough for the activation to complete." Blake nodded. "Then let's make it count." The first wave of attackers arrived moments later. Zieth soldiers stormed into the ruins from one side, their energy weapons blazing, while human Marines approached from the other. Blake and Lissa took cover behind the obelisk, firing back as the artifact continued its work. Blake's training kicked in, his shots precise and deliberate. Lissa, though less experienced, proved resourceful, using the terrain to her advantage. Together, they held their ground, but the sheer number of enemies was overwhelming. As the battle raged on, the artifact emitted a sudden burst of light, its pulse growing faster. Lissa glanced at it, her expression hopeful. "It's almost ready," she shouted over the chaos. Blake nodded, but his focus remained on their attackers. He could see both sides closing in, their determination to stop the activation evident. "Stay with the artifact," he yelled to Lissa. "I'll buy you more time." "No," she protested, but Blake was already moving, drawing the enemy's fire away from the obelisk. Lissa watched in horror as Blake fought valiantly, his figure a blur of motion amidst the chaos. She knew he was risking everything, and her resolve to see their mission through strengthened. The artifact's pulse reached its peak, and a blinding light filled the chamber. Lissa shielded her eyes, her heart pounding as the truth began to broadcast across both Scifi and human channels. As the light subsided, the room fell eerily silent. The battle temporarily halted as soldiers from both sides stared at the artifact in stunned disbelief. Blake staggered back toward Lissa, blood staining his uniform, but a determined look on his face. "Did it work?" Lissa nodded, tears in her eyes. It worked. For the first time in years, Blake allowed himself to hope that the end of the war was finally within reach. The artifact's light faded, leaving the ruins of Arian eerily quiet. The silence felt heavy, as though the universe itself held its breath. Soldiers from both sides, Scifi and human, stood frozen, their weapons lowered, faces illuminated by the faint glow of the now dormant artifact. Blake leaned heavily against the obelisk, breathing hard. Blood seeped through a wound on his side, but he ignored it, his focus on Lissa and the artifact. She stood in front of the platform, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge, her eyes locked on the glowing crystal. Did it work?" Blake asked, his voice strained. Lissa nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "The truth is out there now. They've seen it." Across the galaxy, the artifact's broadcast reached every communication network, civilian and military alike. Images and data streams flooded screens and consoles, revealing the lies that had perpetuated the war. People on both sides saw the secret meetings, the fabricated reports, and the orchestrated attacks designed to keep the conflict alive. They saw how power and greed had manipulated them into hating each other. On human colony worlds, soldiers and civilians alike watched in disbelief as the truth unfolded. On Scifi-controlled planets, warriors and leaders stared at their screens, their expressions ranging from shock to fury. The revelation was undeniable, and it was changing everything. Back in the ruins, the stillness broke as murmurs spread among the soldiers. Both human and Scifi fighters exchanged uncertain glances, their grips on their weapons slackening. The truth had shaken them, and for the first time in years, the hatred that fueled their actions faltered. A Scifi captain, his armor scorched from the recent battle, stepped forward, his bright red eyes locked onto Blake and Lissa. This changes nothing," he growled, his voice filled with defiance but tinged with uncertainty. "The war will continue." "No, it won't," Blake said, pushing himself off the obelisk. His voice carried a strength that belied his injuries. "You've seen the truth. We've all been used, both humans and Scifi. Do you really want to keep fighting for people who've lied to you, who've sacrificed countless lives just to keep their power?" The Scifi captain hesitated, his claws twitching. Around him, other Scifi soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. The weight of Blake's words and the broadcast hung in the air. A human Marine lowered his rifle and stepped forward. "Captain Reynolds is right," he said, his voice steady. "We've all lost too much in this war. Families, friends. It's time we stop." The Zieth captain glared at the human, but the anger in his eyes was fading. Finally, he let out a low growl and threw his weapon to the ground. "If what you say is true," he said, his voice quieter now, "then we've all been fools." The tension in the ruins eased as more soldiers followed suit, lowering their weapons and stepping away from the fight. Blake exchanged a glance with Lissa, relief washing over him. "We did it," he said softly. Lissa smiled faintly, but her expression remained serious. "This is only the beginning. The truth is out, but it will take time for both sides to heal. There will still be those who resist." Blake nodded, his face grim. "Then we'll deal with them. Together." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Messages of ceasefires and truces began spreading across the galaxy, prompted by soldiers and civilians who had seen the broadcast. Leaders on both sides were forced to address the revelations, many scrambling to cover their tracks or deflect blame. On the neutral moon of Arian, Blake and Lissa worked tirelessly to establish a temporary communication hub. The ruins became a symbol of unity, a place where humans and Zieth could come together to discuss the future. The process wasn't easy. There were arguments, mistrust, and moments of near violence. But there were also breakthroughs, small gestures of cooperation and understanding that hinted at the possibility of peace. Blake found himself at the center of these efforts, his military experience and unwavering determination making him a natural leader. Lissa became his counterpart among the Zieth, her wisdom and insight earning her the respect of even the most skeptical warriors. One evening, as the twin moons of Arian cast their silver light over the ruins, Blake and Lissa stood together near the obelisk. The artifact, now dormant, sat nearby, its purpose fulfilled. "You know," Blake said, breaking the silence, "I didn't think we'd make it this far." Lissa smiled, her silver eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Neither did I. But you taught me something important, Captain." "What's that?" She turned to him, her expression serious. "That even in the darkest times, hope can find a way. And that sometimes it takes a human's stubbornness to make it happen." Blake chuckled, shaking his head. "You're giving me too much credit." "No," she said softly, her gaze unwavering. "You deserve it." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of everything they'd been through settling over them. But it was a comfortable silence, filled with the promise of a better future. The war that had ravaged the galaxy for decades didn't end overnight, but the truth sparked a change that couldn't be stopped. Humans and Zieth began to see each other not as enemies, but as victims of the same deceit. And in the ruins of Arian, where two enemies had become allies, a new chapter of history began.